We're going to talk about kind of analytical frameworks or tools that are focused or developed based on the conception of systems. So, and I mean, this is something that's really interesting to me, because I've been working on this stuff for a lot, well, officially since undergrad, I guess, since Waterloo, which was, geez, 93, so well, a long time ago, longer than I'd like to admit, 20 plus years. So what I'm going to give is just a high-level view in a short period of time as to what I think these are about and their use, like why you want to use these tools for, particularly for the kind of work that we're talking about. In this course, it's about communication, education for the environment, for my environmental applications. But you can really use these tools in a lot of different situations. If you're like looking at a more of an analytical type of problem, say trying to assess what's going on in a biophysical environmental system, or if you want to look at, say, cultural systems or anthropological systems, economic systems, these tools can be applied in all of these different contexts. So what I'm going to do is just give you a high-level view of the basis of the frameworks, and then you can start to see how they might apply. I'm going to give some examples how we will use it in this particular course and these types of things we're working on. But you know, if you have any questions, then just jump in. So the topic we're going to talk about is systems, cybernetics, and communications, conceptualizing an ecological reality. So a lot of this is kind of, even when you say the word, and I would caution you about this stuff as well. So for those that are in the course and you're working, like say in the energy sector or whatever it might be, whatever type of job you're working on, be a little bit judicious as to how you use these tools in terms of just naming them. Like, I don't often walk into meetings. Like today, I had a meeting with a group called the GVFDRR, Global Facility for Disaster Risk Response, which is part of it's like a facility that works with the World Bank for disasters. And I'm not going to be, I don't think I would like come out and say, well, we need to really use systems theory and cybernetics to address these really pressing problems with, you know, severe disasters. The reason why I would avoid doing that, at least right off the bat, would be for this term right away, the abstract. So whenever you say, like, not so much systems theory and systems analysis have kind of gone mainstream to some degree, and Peter Senge has a lot to do with that, the guy who wrote The Fifth Discipline. So systems thinking has become very popular in business and management thinking and management literature. So that's okay. I mean, people will get, oh, we need to use a systems approach. Fine, everybody gets that. And technology people, they get that too. But if you were to say, oh, I think we really need to use second order cybernetics, I mean, people will just like look at you funny, most likely, anyway. So I'm not saying that that's kind of good or bad. It's just the reaction you may get. And the reason why that is because I think not as many people are familiar with it and its utility, and they equate it to the abstract. And in a way it is, and I'll show you why. So what all of these are, systems theory, cybernetics, second order cybernetics, semiotics, these kind of things, are essentially models for helping us to understand the world. That's really what they are. And with that, we kind of, at the same time, we've got to be careful about how much trust we put in certain models, you know, because for this first reason right here, paradigms are based upon the conceptual models that we ascribe to the world, right? So there were times in history where we thought the Earth was flat, right? And that was a conceptual model. It was what we perceived as the nature of our reality, a flat Earth. Whereas, you know, that paradigm was smashed once we discovered that through scientific inquiry that the world, in fact, was not flat. At least we think it's not flat. I mean, maybe it's, you know, we're pretty darn sure it's circular, at least close to it. But there may be things that we're missing already. So I always kind of keep that in my back pocket. But paradigms are based on these conceptual models that we ascribe to the world. So Newtonian mechanics is a paradigm. It's a way of thinking about physics that has governed really our modern development. Spiritual worldviews. So this is a way of like Judeo-Christian values, for instance, or a lens through which people look at the world. In our assignment for this next assignment, assignment 3, where we're looking at First Nations worldviews, these are lenses that people look through the world, and they're paradigms that are governed by certain understandings. Economic models are another set of models that we apply to the world. So neoclassical economics is one way of looking at the economy and how we govern ourselves. Ecological economics is another way of looking at the world, where we place a far greater emphasis on ecological capital and the fact that we don't have necessarily room for infinite growth based on the consumption of environmental materials. And then the last one there is progressive economics, so where we put more emphasis on progressive values in economic systems and pluralistic values, like, for instance, the role of equality, equity, gender, sexuality, all these kind of things. And lastly, dynamic philosophical frameworks are part of this. So I classify these things that I'm listing tonight and we're going to go through as systems theory, cybernetics, and second-order cybernetics and ecosemiotics as dynamic philosophical frameworks. That's really what they are if you want to put them in categorize them. They're frameworks that we can use to try and help us understand certain situations. So what are they? Well, we use these to help capture interactions and dependencies, and we try and capture them somehow. So we try and understand. We can look at, like, say, for instance, society, or we can look at a social situation, we can look at atmospheric phenomenon, or what have you, and we try and put some sort of model, logical model, that can help us understand what's going on and how these things relate. So we live in a world of systems within systems within systems. This is kind of how we can conceive the world. And dynamic models help us to understand how processes and phenomena interact. Like, this is how we try and make sense of all that stuff. And this is a really important tool set for folks like us who are attempting to apply science and social science and human science to address environmental problems or realize sustainability. We kind of need to use these tool sets. However, we need to be aware of the complexity of these systems and not to over or undersimplify them. And this is where the real challenge comes in, because sometimes we can get really, really, really complicated with our models and with how we're trying to understand things, and that can cause people to run away. And this is what I said right off the bat. You need to be somewhat judicious as to how you use this terminology, specifically in professional settings, but even just generally. Like, sometimes you can overcomplicate a system, over-model a system. And simple models sometimes can work just fine. However, at the same time, it depends on what we're trying to get at. If we're trying to get at really intricate processes, then we might need more of a sophisticated or more finely tuned or higher precision model. So evolution of systems thinking. All of these things I would categorize into these models, I guess, if you were frameworks, are types of systems thinking. And they evolve over time. They have evolved over time. So what I'd like to do when I look at this stuff is to first and foremost take a look at how these ideas have evolved over time. And this allows us to see the roots of ideas that we commonly take for granted. Like I was saying, at one point we thought the Earth was flat. I've taught remote sensing before, a lot actually, which is a course in Earth observation using satellites to look at the Earth. And in that course, it's interesting because the first thing I do, remote sensing, is involving computers and satellite imagery, and then combining it together to look at land use change or photosynthetic activity or whatever, anything that we can observe off of sunlight that's reflected from the Earth, or that we direct at the Earth and it gets reflected back to the sensor. Now, when I teach that course, what I like to do right off the bat is look at where it came from. One of the first things I look at with that course is to show them is early remote sensing. And early remote sensing was actually the Germans put cameras on the feet of pigeons and sent them over different countries throughout Europe to try and get a good understanding of what the landscapes look like. And they called it the Bavarian Pigeon Brigade. And this was their version of remote sensing. So, I mean, really, the whole paradigm had shifted by the time we came to today, where we have, you know, even now, even where we have drones and so forth. So it's important to look at the roots of these ideas to see where they came from originally and then where we're at today and if they're relevant or not. So a good example is a derivative. The conceptualization and development of calculus was very fundamental at those concrete rules and assumptions form the basis for many things to come. So the actual derivative, the change of one variable with respect to another variable, if you look around your world and see the built reality of everything, I could attribute a lot of that to calculus. You know, that's where, and Newtonian physics. And that was a paradigm that was so powerful and is so powerful that it gave us the scientific tools to construct a technological and physical world and shelter and so forth that, and technology that can mobilize us from one side of it to the other via plane, and then also provide us with high-density housing, etc. So I say here, if you look around downtown or a built environment, you can trace it all back to calculus, really. When we look at problems of interrelated systems, we need to think of practical issues, but also theories that contribute to our understanding of these points. Much like calculus being the bedrock of infrastructural development, when we're looking at systems and interrelated systems, I suggest that we look at some of the base kind of principles by which that form the base that can be foundational to help us start to frame our problem. So we have to ask ourselves then, in terms of systems thinking, what are the bodies of knowledge we need to think about when we're attempting to address complex social, human, economic, and ecological problems? And I'm offering some different schools of thought, and there are others, but these are ones that I think are the key ones to cover in the short period of time we have tonight, that I think are useful to apply. First one is systems theory, second is cybernetics, third is second-order cybernetics, and lastly is semiotics and ecosemiotics. And I think I place more emphasis on the first three and less so on the last one, just because the last one is less developed. There needs to be a bit more work done, I think. It's relatively newish, I would say. Not semiotics, but ecosemiotics in the last, I don't know, 15 years or so. These ways of thinking about problems can take us from the reality. So we look at a situation, much like, say, a natural resource conflict or something of that nature, and then we take that into an abstract, right? We're trying to abstract from that and create a different model of that, right? And then with that model and in the abstract view of that situation, we can try and think about it, see what's going on, like either if it's a biophysical model or trying to understand how people are perceiving it, what are some of the dynamics there, estimating what some of those dynamics are and so forth, and then try and kind of come up with some like rules or behaviors or a better understanding of what's going on, but then translate that back to the reality. And bring us back from that abstract to reality with hopefully a better understanding of how to deal with the problems we are confronted with, right? And that has been the power of things such as Newtonian physics, and also when we'll look at ecological modeling and so forth. So first, systems theory. Now, systems theory is not new. This was it initially came from a gentleman by the name of Carl Ludwig van Bertalanffy, who came up with something called general systems theory. And I think that was in '43. It was in the 40s, 1940s, around there. And Bertalanffy, I believe he's a scientist, but I think more on the biology side of things, because he worked a lot with growth models and things like this. It was based on growth theorem on biological systems, but what he did there, which was kind of interesting, and if you want, I would suggest looking further into this, is that there were some assumptions that had been placed that the laws of thermodynamics applied universally, like in all situations, whereas what he posited with general systems theory was that, yes, the law of thermodynamics do apply to closed systems, but not necessarily to open systems. And that then led to kind of the need for different ways of looking at certain situations. Technically, it's the interdisciplinary study of systems. It's based on the fact that we can conceive of the world or situations in a systems framework. So a system is a cohesive combination of interrelated and interdependent parts. And you often have to define, when you're trying to model a situation, you have to define them based on their relationships. So it's you can define the relationship between the parts, and also you need to define the system's boundaries. So I'll walk in the next slide. I'm going to walk through, like, just explain how I have applied this myself or continue to apply it. But you really have to think about what are the components of the situation you're looking at. How do those components relate? Under what circumstances they interact with one another? And then you have to think about, in this point here, address boundaries, right? And this is really important when you're starting to look at like, say, carbon footprinting or anything like that, any kind of organizational analysis. And those boundaries need to be defined as system boundaries, either based on functional boundaries, so what are you trying to understand in terms of what's going on and what's working in space, so it could be geospatial, it could be three-dimensional space, or it can be in time, over what period of time you're looking at. So this is a very useful model for organizing complex and dynamic situations. It's really useful, and like I mentioned Peter Senge before, and he's experienced quite a bit of success with his ideas in applying systems theory and systems analysis to management problems and organizations. And his book is called The Fifth Discipline, which it's a good read. It's a big book. It's I don't know, 500+ pages or something, big, thick, like encyclopedic type of volume, but it's good. I know it was in the 90s that got it released. It's often said that a system can be more than the sum of its parts, and what often is called, they're called emergent properties. So these are properties of a system that are not attributed to any one component, but they are properties that are result from the function of the overall system and the interaction between the different parts, right? So how would you use this? Well, you can use it in a bunch of different ways. So I've used this in ecological problems. So for instance, if you were looking at, say, a lake system, and you wanted to look at, say, nutrient loading in a lake as kind of a consulting project or something like that, what you would want to do is define your system boundary as, where you constrain that. Like, is it the watershed? Is it the lakes themselves? Excuse me. But define the system boundary and then start to look at some of the components within that lake that you're most interested in. Now, a lake would be an interesting one to look at and break down, because you can go to an incredible levels of detail in a lake if you wanted to, right down to the microbial level. But quite often, what I've done anyway in projects is looked at mass balance. So you define the lake and you look at what are the things that I'm interested in. Well, I'm interested in certain parameters: temperature, dissolved oxygen, the amount of coliform or biological activity in the lake, the amount of loads of certain chemicals and or nutrients, meaning particularly you would look at nitrogen and phosphorus, and then some of the dynamics that might affect that, right? So in the case of nitrogen and phosphorus, you'd want to start to kind of look at, well, what are the inputs? Where is it coming from? So you start to draw it, right? You start to draw your system, which would be this black box, the lake, and then you've got stuff coming in, energy, inflow of water, you've got the inflow of nutrients, and then start to look at some of the internal dynamics there, like, say, for instance, the uptake of nutrients by biological material there. So like the use of nitrates and phosphates by algae, right? And then you start to look at what are the dynamics in terms of rates, right? And this is where you can actually go from a system conception, like a heuristic, we would call that, like this is a heuristic model of what's going on in this lake, to actually a process model. You'd look at like actual rates of uptake of certain things or change of certain variables. And that's where you get into, like, we would use Stella to do that, which is a modeling software, and you can then translate that into a system of differential equations if you wanted to. And you can do that in MATLAB or some other kind of software, and then you can run the model. So that's using a systems theory approach to ecological problems, right? Social problems, You could look at a community, for instance. What are the community dynamics within using systems approach? Economic problems, that's what I'm working on right now, is looking at how are economics working in certain regions, and what are some factors that we aren't considering. Like in my case, I'm looking at the role of environmental services in in the economies of certain coastal regions, and what are their dynamics if you start to price those, and so forth. And what we'll do is we're looking at how to apply a systems framework to that to see what are the things that we're interested in, how do they relate to one another, and then how can we model that and see how they interact with each other, and are there emergent properties, right? And you can go to the level of actually modeling something mathematically, but you don't necessarily need to. Systems theory can be applied all the way through to very quantitative to very qualitative analysis. Cultural and human problems, how values and behaviors function. And then, like I said here, modern incantations have led to systems thinking in the organizational context. So you see a lot of this actually, and I would recommend reading some of the literature on this because it's pervasive really, and it's quite useful. I'm glad to see it being used more widely. And Peter Senge's book would be a good start, and there's some other literature out there useful. So I mean, systems theory is good, and in fact for the course and the assignments I would recommend doing a systems model of the situation you're looking at, like your observation, and then trying to ascertain what's going on with that, literally by drawing it. Cybernetics is the next kind of framework that we're dealing with. So cybernetics sounds kind of weird right off the bat. Even when you say it, people are like, what? That sounds weird. But it's not really weird. It's actually really useful these days, considering what's going on in our world, especially with things such as social media and so forth. So what it's defined as is the transdisciplinary study of regulatory systems and their application and behavior. That's one of the definitions. So Wiener defined it as, this is in 1948, so obviously things have changed dramatically since then, the scientific study of control and communication in the animal and the machine. So that's the 1948 definition of it. So loosely speaking, you could define cybernetics as the study of the control of any system using technology. I do believe some people might counter-argue and say, well, you don't necessarily need to include technology in that. I usually, in my kind of way of thinking about cybernetics, I usually see it as some sort of social technology interaction type of situation with feedback mechanisms in place. There generally is some sort of feedback mechanism in a cybernetic analysis. The word that it's derived from is Greek, which is cybernetis, or it might be pronounced something in a different way in Greek, but that's the word itself, which means governance. So that's an important distinction to make. So systems theory is just looking at systems dynamics and so forth, whereas cybernetics involves some method of control. There's a control mechanism there. Either it can be an ascribed control, like there's actually like, okay, we're applying this kind of control, changing something, governance, policy, what have you, or even changing, I don't know, levels of certain phenomenon in response to feedback. But there's some mode of control. It could be inbred in the system, so there's like a homeostatic mechanism. So homeostasis is when a system self-regulates. That could be technically a cybernetic analysis. Like for instance, when we get hot and we start to sweat and we start to cool down. I mean, that's in essence there's a feedback and control mechanism happening there. So some things that are often researched or thought of, looked at with cybernetic research are learning, cognition, communication, connectivity. Things such as this are often research themes in the cybernetic literature. So where would you use it? Like I said, I usually see it or have applied it in the interface of humans with technology, so physical and social interaction. In addition, I see it in technosocial problems that have dynamic feedback processes that need to be understood. So for example, if you wanted to look at how this idea of smart cities actually works or might work, right? I mean, to me, that would be something that you'd want to look at the cybernetic literature and say, okay, well, I think this is this really requires cybernetic thinking in order to kind of frame this. You want to look at that and say, okay, well, I need to create some sort of abstract model of what I'm defining as a smart city, right? Personally, I would start to look at cybernetics as kind of an analytical framework for looking at that. It's not the only way of looking at it. You could look at it from an ethnographic standpoint if you wanted to. But in my case, I would be looking at it from a sustainability standpoint, and I would want to look at some of the control and dynamics of that system. Another stuff that I work on with my team is largely related to data and software and things like climate change and reporting and environmental policy. So in our world, we would do a cybernetic analysis of how do data platforms work in regard to adaptive governance for climate change, developing climate resilience in small island developing states, right? Like in Trinidad or St. Lucia or some countries like this. This is the stuff that that I work on with my team, and we would look at cybernetics if we wanted to look at it as a kind of a systems analysis, the whole system. We start to apply the cybernetic approach and cybernetic literature to that as a framework. So key there is dynamic control processes. There's a control mechanism in place, and generally some sort of technological social interaction happening. Second order cybernetics. So I had cautioned you about saying, oh, we're going to use cybernetics in this situation while you're sitting with your colleagues talking about environmental management or something like that. Or say the board of directors comes in and you say, well, we're going to lead with cybernetics. They will look at you funny if you say we're going to lead with second order cybernetics. They're going to look at you even more funny. So, and that's not to say this is like not useful stuff. It's very useful, but not widely known, right? So you might want to just kind of exercise a bit of caution how you use it. I've been reamed out for even thinking of using second order cybernetics before by one of my mentors. He's not a big fan of it, so he told me that in not so many words when we first started working together. That was Mario Bungi, who's very much a systems guy. He's not into second order cybernetics. So second order cybernetics, what it is, it's known as the cybernetics of cybernetics. So I put a note here, yes, you can start to shake your head here. But in all seriousness, I think it's very important. I think it's something we need to think about, because it deals with how we perceive systems and the analysis of systems. It's a lot to do with how we perceive of systems. How we perceive of our analysis of systems, cybernetic systems. So it's particularly important where we want to examine, say, biases or perspectives that may be pervasive in situations, particularly in disciplinary. And this is very important these days when we talk of things such as post-normal science and different worldviews and incorporating values that perhaps have not been taken as seriously before. So it's a useful kind of model for that, just because we can take a step back. Like we can take a kind of here's how we're viewing the situation. Like say we're doing analysis or environmental impact assessment or whatever it might be, and you can take kind of like a higher level view of that situation to start to look at, well, maybe we're exercising some, maybe there's biases that we're bringing this in the way we're actually conceiving of how this whole situation works, right? And we do bring our own worldviews and our own bias and our own trust in science or distrust in science or whatever it might be to how we kind of frame a certain situation. And this is where I think it's quite useful. So the Heinz von Forster and Margaret Mead were two of the early proponents of second order cybernetics, and that was in the years roughly between 1968 and 1975. So if you go back, it's basically about 20 to 30 years before general systems theory was made widely known. So circularity and recursive analysis are fundamental parts of second order cybernetics. So you may have heard of reflective practice or even hermeneutics. These are kind of two research methods or ways of thinking about things that are quite common in the social sciences. Hermeneutics is quite popular in research, and it's literature. So cognitive processes, as well as how we establish meaning and knowledge itself, are often subjects that are critically analyzed with this approach. So I've mentioned to you the ontology and epistemology. So ontology is essentially how we establish meaning for things. Okay, I view this as a table. This is a table, right, in front of me. When my laptop is on a table, and then epistemology is how I know about this. Well, I know about this table. We know about science through, I don't know, deductive processes or something of that nature. So how we establish knowing about things, or construct knowledge about things, and assigning meaning to things. And if you think about it, when you're doing a meta-analysis of systems, that's exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to look at, okay, well, if this is our system that we've drawn out in part to model, say, a multi-stakeholder assessment of fisheries, perhaps that might be something we're looking at. What are, like, why is it we define these things? Why do we say that these fisheries are fisheries, for instance? These people, and how we define our dynamic. When we go about making that definition of that system, is it valid? Like, what are some assumptions that we make when we do that, and what are some tools that we're using in order to abstract reality? So it's a useful tool for critical analysis of human perception of systems. So if we want to critically analyze the perception of systems, this is a very good thing to use, and it can be natural or technical. It can be used to model how people are perceiving a situation. One anecdotal way of looking at it would be the mile-high view, right? So if you want to take the mile-high view of what's going on in, say, I don't know, with the Trans Mountain Pipeline Extension project, you could use a second-order cybernetic analysis and say, okay, well, you've got all these different stakeholders interacting. Some of them view this as something different, right? Some people are viewing oil as you know, as purely just a commodity, something that we need to refine, sell, and make money from, whereas others may be viewing it as something destructive from the earth, right? Something that's being reaped and pulled from the earth. So those are the kind of questions you might want to put on the table when you're doing that kind of mile-high analysis of a situation such as that. You could conceive of this as a meta-analysis. So meta-analysis is, when you use the word analysis, it means you're doing like an analysis of an analysis, like metadata. So metadata, when you're talking about GIS or geospatial information, is information about information, right? So it's the field names or descriptions of the data that you have gathered. So it's not the actual data, but the description of it. So in this case, it's not the actual system or the actual analysis, but the analysis of the analysis. So it's useful in research in multi-stakeholders. However, this can drive you insane. So beware when diving into this stuff, because you can easily lose yourself in this, which is maybe a good thing, but I just find it very interesting stuff and useful. So semiotics, the last set is semiotics and ecosemiotics. So these are some fundamental things that we need to think about when we talk about semiotics and ecosemiotics: epistemology, ontology, the sciences, natural, human, and social, and cosmology. So I'm going to talk more about worldviews and how you relate that to semiotics and ecosemiotics. So you need to think about how we know of things, like what kind of knowledge systems are applied in order to know of a situation. So it could be, like, for instance, quite often we think of natural sciences and epistemology, right? Qualitative science, social science is an epistemology. Traditional knowledge, that's an epistemology, right? It's a way of knowing of a certain phenomenon. Ontology, what are things? Like, why is a tree, right? Why is a tree to one person, whereas it may be something else to another person? That's kind of assigning meaning to things. And I've listed sciences, and then cosmology I've listed there as just kind of a worldview. A cosmology is one way of saying, what is your cosmology? What's your way of viewing the world, the cosmos? And this is most relevant to situations where we're dealing with traditional knowledge. So worldviews, I think, are important to semiotics and ecosemiotics. At least they are in terms of my interest in using semiotics and ecosemiotics. And worldviews, and this is important for our assignment that we're working on now, it's a matter of perspective. We have to understand how different cultures will view a situation or each other. So one way of looking at worldviews in the Canadian First Nations context is in terms of the gaze. And this is coming from First Nations colleagues of mine. This is a way of looking at how we view things, I guess, and this is how it was expressed to me as an important thing that needs to be understood, at least by non-Indigenous peoples, at least in Canada, is the gaze, is shifting the gaze, and quite often when we look at First Nations issues in Canada or even Indigenous issues elsewhere in the world, we look at Indigenous peoples, Indigenous beliefs, and so forth, but shifting the gaze it means shifting your perspective, meaning take your perspective, try and put yourself in there in First Nation, and shift the gaze back to you, back to us, like back to Western society. What if we were to shift the gaze? What if we were to do that? What if we were to look at ourselves through the eyes of Indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere? And this is just, I mentioned it here because it was really something important that came up with some work that I was doing in the winter here. And I think it's important to think about, at least, especially when we start to look at how do we find meaning, because it dramatically from different cultures. So in terms of knowledge systems, how do we bridge or connect or relate different knowledge systems? How do we do it? What's involved with that? Just one solution to bridging or even just integrating or creating holistic knowledge systems. There's many ways to do it, depending on where you are and who you're working with and what the systems are. So Western society demands rigor in our analysis and logic in our thinking. We cannot deny that. So when we start to look at, like, say, in the world of academic research or scientific research, there's certain logic that that is required, or at least called upon or accepted, and certain bodies of knowledge that are called upon. I don't think we can deny that. I mean, that's something that we've built up on, but I think we can question that. I think we can look at whether or not that always applies. So we have years of disciplinary knowledge that has framed our positions, for better or for worse. Our position on environmental policy, like our perception of climate change, for instance, is based on scientific knowledge, and we have powerful findings as a result of that. But that's not to say that's the only way of looking at the problem, right? There's other worldviews that I think are very informative and useful to include. So I'm not sure sure we can or should throw this out. Western thought science has taken us a long way, but we might want to be somewhat modest in the application of it and open in the integration of different knowledge systems. So First Nations knowledge is fundamentally different than a Western framework. Values tend to be different, as well as the time frame under which we're looking. So time frames tend to be longer, 1,000-year views, for instance. Characteristics of knowing nature are quite a bit different. And there's the notion of intergenerational equity. What will be left for grandchildren, for instance, is a word that I've heard quite often, a phrase from First Nations groups, and I don't hear that as much in at least generally speaking in Western society. So it's a different cosmology, and the cosmologies vary between different groups. Whatever statement should be given back is another phrase that's quite often used. Some authors to look to for this I've listed here the Ignacies. That's not Ignacio, it's the Ignacy. Cajete, he's Navajo. So Ignacy is from the Shuswap region. Atleo from British Columbia. John Burroughs he's Anishinaabe, I believe, and he's at UVic. And Peter Menzies, who's at UBC. So these are some authors to look through for this. I highly recommend the book by Ignacy based on the Shuswap lands. So First Nations, I'm going to skip through Western knowledge, knowing the environment, get to semiotics. So one of the things about knowing the environment, one of the things we need to look at is how we know of the environment from a basic standpoint. It's a philosophical question, but it also has epistemological and ontological ramifications. So we observe and experience our surrounding, our environment, and suppositions based on those observations. So it's a philosophical and perceptual exercise. So, but at the root of that, there's a process that's happening, and this is where we're kind of getting at the role of semiotics here. How does it work? So how do we perceive, understand, and assign meaning? And one model of doing that, one model of understanding that, and this is again back to the process of abstracting from the world. We're looking at a situation, trying to create an abstract model of how we think things are happening, is coming from the philosophy of Charles Peirce, who was considered to be the founder of semiotics. Peirce was an American philosopher. Many people call him the greatest American philosopher ever produced. He's a mathematician, geographer by training, but really is the breadth of his work, or what he's most known for, is philosophy. Influenced by Kant, but known more as a pragmatist, and brought a sense of pragmatism to discourse at the time that was dominated very much so by metaphysics. And semiotics is what came out of that, which is known as the philosophy of signs, or representation and meaning. Okay, ecosemiotics. I'm not going to go too far into it, and if you want, I can share some readings which would be useful to kind of get you more up to speed as to the logic behind it. But I wanted to kind of just cover in the time that we have the general approach. Ecosemiotics is something that's evolved from that, and I think it's a little more relevant to what we're working on. So we're dealing with nature, ecosystems, and how do we manage ourselves and communicate about ecosystems. And ecosemiotics is really in its very early stages right now. I'd say only about, I don't know, I guess mid-80s is when it started to be talked about, and so the literature's out there, but there still needs to be a lot more practical application of it. It's just in my opinion. So the 8 principles that ecosemiotics is based on is, number 1, the structure of ecological communities is based on semiotic bonds, meaning signing. So understanding, communication of and signing between phenomena, meaning communication by the understanding of what different things are in an ecosystem, right? So, like for instance, a predator-prey relationship. Predator-prey relationship would be based on semiotic bonds. The predator understands that the prey is a vulnerable species that is there for them to eat if they can catch it and then sustain themselves on. That's kind of a rudimentary explanation of it. Changing signs can change the order of things, so living organisms can change their environment on the basis of their own images of that environment. Semiosis-regulated ecosystem meaning-making both stabilizes and destabilizes them. Human symbolic semiosis, this is small, I'm sorry, with a contextualization and environmental degradation are deeply related. So, and this basically is talking about how we perceive of and understand environmental processes, or the environment, is largely related to environmental degradation. So, for instance, a demonstration of this is whether or not we believe in environmental services. I guess this is, I'll give you an example. So, human symbolic semiosis would be how we symbolize or understand what nature is. So, back to the example of the Trans Mountain Pipeline Extension Project, or something like that, or let's say an impact of that, one could look at that situation and say, in this context, is something that we can derive a resource from, exploit it, sell it, and make money, right? Whereas another person could look at it and say, well, actually, that environmental system is sustaining us in a certain way. So, for instance, some of the risks that are posed by that problem are, there's a heavy amount of weight attached to them. So some other people might have a different semiotic attachment to the environment in that particular situation. So, well, geez, the risks to the coastal zone are far too great for us to take a chance with this project, right? They would attach some sort of meaning to, say, the environmental services that are provided by the coastal zone, like tourism, for instance. That's an example of human symbolic semiosis. Energetically and biochemically, human culture is part of ecosystems. Semiotically, culture is both part of a meta level of the semiotic ecological network. So culture is a part of the meta level. So our culture is derived from the ecological network. It's related and embedded the ecological network informs and we derive value from a cultural standpoint from the ecological network. The environment as a spatial temporal manifestation of an ecosystem as an interface for semiotic and communicative relations. The environment is a spatial temporal framework that ecosystem function occurs in, and there's an interface for semiotic and communicative relations, meaning signing relationships and communication between humans and nature and within nature. The narrative description is inadequate for the description of ecological semiosis. A narrative, there needs to be some sort of logical framework attached. A narrative description, meaning just explaining how this is working, is not sufficient enough to describe how ecological process or ecological signing is working. And lastly, the concept of culture is incomplete without an ecological dimension. A theory of culture is incomplete without the ecosemiotic aspect. So meaning, and I mean that could vary from time to time, from place to place. You could say, for instance, maybe that's not the case. Whereas in the coastal zone of British Columbia, you could make that argument quite strongly. It would depend upon the culture, I would say. So the challenge lies in finding models that are accepted by. This needs to be done in a respectable way. It also requires pragmatism. We need to have a useful approach. One example is the Millennium Assessment has set a precedent for looking at different worldviews and ways of viewing the world, worldviews and frameworks or logical frameworks for that, not necessarily to the detail of cybernetics and so forth and so on, but in their case it was more about popularizing environmental services. And in British Columbia, most definitely as relevant to our assignment for this, we are very much ready for this way of thinking to be employed. So I've talked a lot of stuff. Some of it might sound like gobbledygook, but where to from here? So what do you do with this stuff? Well, I've been doing this for quite a while, so I've had the opportunity to try out a lot of this stuff, maybe less so second-order cybernetics and ecosemiotics. For sure, I haven't done as much application. Certainly, systems analysis, a ton of it. And my advice is to apply the models. That's what I would do in order to see how this works for you as a tool set. Start to look closer at the literature behind these frameworks and see what you think works in a given situation and then apply it. And in this course, we'll have the opportunity to do that with the stakeholder, the multi-stakeholder team project, as well as from a philosophical standpoint, looking at the different worldviews. You can start to look at, well, okay, well, how does this stuff work given this situation? Like in the next assignment, how would this work given the fact that we have certain observations we're trying to assess? You know, we're like trying to look at how someone might perceive this observation of a certain environmental phenomenon. So try it out. Try these models and see what works. Be prepared for the application that one learns from doing. I learn more from trying working this than I have from reading about it necessarily. The most valuable lessons I've learned have been through applying these tools. And you will find that some will or will not work in a given situation. Some just, maybe systems theory won't work in a given situation. Just be prepared to fail. That's the thing. If it doesn't work out, that's all right, especially in something like an academic context or a course. It doesn't need to work out necessarily, but just make sure you manage the risks. If you're trying to do this in a professional setting, manage the risks. Like when I said, I don't know if I'd come out in a board meeting and say, well, we really need to apply second-order cybernetics in order to reach our quarterly targets or something like that. Get some weird looks. So yeah, just manage the risks and try it out. So that's what I recommend for this. So that is a high-level view of some ways of knowing and analytic systems frameworks that I've used or work on, and I try them out and see how it works for you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, that was a lot of information. It's all recorded and the slides are available for you. I thought it was light, personally, but maybe not. Like I said, I've been working on this stuff for a long time, so it's just kind of second nature to me. Admittedly, the ecosemiotic stuff is a little more esoteric. It's a little more kind of philosophical, I'd say. But it's interesting stuff. I think cybernetics, systems theory, and even second-order cybernetics are a lot more tractable. I mean, you can read up a bit on that and then apply it and probably be okay. Semiotics are a little more tricky. Yeah, take some time to digest it. I'm trying to think of an example of, you know, I mean, when I was doing my master's in, I would like to try and apply something in the field, just make sure. Yeah, I mean, it's going to take some time. The first thing to do is read about it. Just read about it. There's, I can provide some references. Just start with a Google search of systems theory, and then I would some cybernetics, second-order cybernetics. Second-order cybernetics can get really kind of crazy-ish stuff. There's a lot of like kind of. I'll post a couple articles actually. I found some good articles from second-order cybernetic literature that's particularly pertaining to environmental systems that would be useful. I'll post that on Moodle. And start with that, and then follow your interest. I just find this incredibly interesting stuff, and it can. I almost think, honestly, it's emancipatory, meaning it's freeing. Like it can free you. Sometimes I find in some of our projects, you get caught. Although very interesting when you work for the UN and you're doing kind of policy analysis and data integration and all that kind of stuff to help a small island developing state deal with climate change. It's not boring work. It's super interesting. But you kind of get caught in the policy talk, like mainstreaming this and that, and climate change adaptation, and you can get stuck sometimes in the way things are done, right? What this allows you to do is, and when I say it's emancipatory, you can look at a situation and say, "Wow, geez, how can we look at this in a different way?" And start to kind of look at, and even draw it out, and start to kind of play with it, the situation in a different way, and think about how you perceive of this, or how other people perceive of this situation, even climate change. How do people think about it, perceive of it in a different country, like a country that will be flooded potentially? Look at it from a system standpoint, a second-order cybernetics. It goes in really interesting avenues you can follow as a result of that. And that's why I say it's emancipatory, because it can emancipate you. It can like elevate you out of the rut that you may be in, even if it is an interesting rut to be in. It can bring you to a different world of thinking about things, which I think is useful. With the different ethical views of various stakeholders. Yes. Okay, Adrian, I'm going to write that down just one second. That's where I'm at, Adrian. That's how I'm using it right now on coastal zone of BC. I'm trying to figure out how that can work in like an ecosystem services framework, and traditional knowledge being integrated with Western science, but then data to go with that and actually do risk analysis. And I don't have a solution. I don't know what the answer is, so I'm working on it. But I'll make a note of that. I think this is what we need to use in order to address that problem. Address the problem of dramatically different worldviews on shared environmental problems with respect to First Nations and Western society. It means something. So I'll send you an email. Okay. Ethical implications. Yeah. That's huge. And legal. What are the legal implications? What does it mean for governance? I think it has massive implications for governance. All right, any other questions or comments? No problem, my pleasure. Great. Okie dokie, so I'll call her at night. That's an hour, so that's too long. All right, so thanks for coming out, and we will see you in the discussion group. Okay, so take it easy. Close with ministry.